This is Stanley H. Tinsley. Today is September the 13th, 1995, and this morning I'm speaking to Dr. Joseph K. Orr of 6503 Westland Drive, Knoxville, Tennessee, and regarding his experiences during World War II. Thank you. Okay, let's sit down. Dr. Orr, if you will, to start here with your high school days and come on up.
Okay, well, I unfortunately ran an old Ford into a bridge in Laramie, Wyoming. Cut my face all up, knocked my teeth out, front teeth out, and so my mother took me to San Francisco for surgical repair, and I went to first year in high school in Lick Wilburn, San Francisco, which was really a rehab high school for World War I veterans. And it was a very interesting experience because we had all sorts of training in draftsmanship and freehand drawing and wood shop and plumbing and masonry.
What year was that?
That was 1924.
Okay.
And then after a year there in San Francisco, we returned to Laramie, and I went to the Laramie High School, which was just an average small city high school, I guess you'd say. And then I had enough credit so that I got into the University of Wyoming in 1926. And I was in the ROTC like everybody else, I guess, at the University of Wyoming were eligible. And following a year there, my mother decided that she'd take her sabbatical year from the University of Wyoming, and we went to Europe. So I spent a year in Europe, and most of the time we spent in Toulouse, France, which was an interesting experience because, among other things, we had our car in a garage there in Toulouse, and one of the mechanics was still picking shrapnel out of his elbow and so on that he'd gotten in World War I. At any rate, on our return from from France, I spent the summer in Laramie, Wyoming University, and that fall I had adequate grades, and I went to Stanford University for about a year, about 3 semesters, and I took pre-medic, which was my original course. And during the time I was at Stanford, I was in the ROTC. But Stanford had cavalry, so I ended up in the ROTC as a sergeant in the cavalry. And the next experience I had, well, I went to the University of Nebraska medical school from 1930 to 1934. And I had nothing to do with the military during this time. But in 1935, I was in Cheyenne after an internship at Kings County Hospital and Northern Pacific Hospital in Tacoma, Washington. And during the time I was in Cheyenne in general practice with an older doctor, I took care of the CCC camp as a medical officer. And I had to ride in the Jeep and ride in the mud and, among other things, met President Roosevelt when he made a tour there. Here comes Russ now. Excuse me.
All right.
And
when he comes in, we'll stop.
During this time, I decided that there was probably going to be a war sooner or later, in which he would be involved. But I didn't think I wanted to be in the Army. I thought maybe I'd like a nicer, cleaner service like the Navy. Excuse me.
Very fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's right.
Way to go.
anyway, having experienced riding around in jeeps and through the mud, they commissioned me as a first lieutenant in the medical corps in the Army. I guess a reserve, you'd say, or U.S. Army. I never quite understood the distinction between the Army and the Army of the United States, something of that sort. Anyway, I met some of the doctors in Cheyenne, including one of them, Sam Zuckerman, who was a pathologist there at the hospital. And Sam and I and another fellow decided that we didn't want to fight the war in the Army because it was too messy. And so we wanted to join the Navy, and that's what we did. And later on, I tell you, I met Sam just at the end of the war, believe it or not. But anyway, I didn't see him again for quite a few years. At any rate, I went to Denver and was inspected and examined, and they decided that I had to have some waivers on my teeth and on my eyes and all this. But I had a commission in the Reserve Navy, and among the things that I was quoted as being not able for sea duty because of my various disabilities, my glasses and my poor teeth. So anyway, didn't hear much then. I practiced in Denver with a neurosurgeon till about 1939, and then for financial reasons I took a general practice in Craig, Colorado, and I was there actually when the Navy called me up. Well, they had accepted me in the Navy as a medical officer, junior medical officer, JG. But they put us with the Marines that they were training there at Camp Elliott, I guess it was. And we had all the mud and all the training that the Marines go through, climbing under barbed wire, riding in tanks, doing all the things that I really thought I was going to avoid. And in addition to that, we walked about 15 to 18 miles 2 or 3 times a week. And that was one of the other things I was hoping to avoid when I get out of the Army. So after about 9 months of this, we were on a 385-mile hike. And I was the junior regimental surgeon, because the regimental surgeon was an old-time 10-year regular Navy medical officer who was John Foley, was an Irishman, and he was given to Irish drink. So he rode around in the ambulance while I walked with the colonel's staff, all of 385 miles. That was a long walk. Anyway, about the last day before we arrived at the terminal in San Diego, the medical officers met around a campfire. And John Foley, the regimental surgeon, said, "You know, I'm getting out of this chicken outfit." He said, "Any of you guys want to change your status as far as the medical?" And I said, "Sure, I'd like to go to a hospital someplace. You know, I don't care whether it's in the Philippines or Hawaii or Panama or whatever." He said, "Well, you don't want to go to the Philippines." He says, "That's going to be a bad spot." So I said, "All right, I'll take Honolulu." So, among others, several fellows wanted to go to the air Pensacola for air training, and one fellow wanted to go fellow from Spokane, decided he'd always wanted to be on destroyers if he were going to be in the Navy. So we sent John Foley to Washington with a case of Johnny Walker Red Label, and he saw a detail officer that he knew, I guess, or had some connection with. And the first thing you know, orders came in, and the fellow went to Pensacola, and another fellow went to Des in Cuba, or wherever that base is down there, that we still have. He was attached to the destroyer division. And then I got orders to Pearl Harbor Hospital in Hawaii. So I was fortunate enough to have orders so that I could take my family. Now, this hadn't always been true of some of the fellows that had been detached. I had two experiences in this regard. About March or April of 41, I had orders to go to Greenland with a defense battalion. And I had drawn my equipment and everything and made arrangements when a Dr. English, who was a senior lieutenant, said, "Joe," he said, "I've been with this outfit that's going up to Greenland," and he said, "I would like to stay with them." He said, "Would you mind if I took your orders instead?" And I said, "Be my guest." I really had no interest in going to Greenland at all. So he got the orders and he went to Greenland, Glenn English. The next deal came along about August of 41, and I had orders to go to Pearl with the 10th Defense Battalion, I believe it was. And I had drawn my orders and equipment, and they told me no. This other fellow, whose name I don't think of at the moment, is senior to you by 3 months, and he will take your orders. So I got out of that. Well, unfortunately, this guy was on Wake Island when it was captured by the Japs, and he spent 4 or 5 years from eating fish heads and rice. So I got out of that deal. And the next thing, then I went to Pearl on the old Whitney, and I was with about 12 junior flyers who were flying PBYs, and I met 2 or 3 of them and became fairly well acquainted with several of them. Out of the 12, 11 of them never made it back to the end of the war. One of them did, and I met him later up in the flight center up there north of Los Angeles. Anyway, that was another story. I had orders to the surgical service at the Pearl Harbor Hospital, and arrived after due time, and was assigned to a surgical ward. And it was there that I served under a Captain Ryan and Paul, can't remember his name, but anyway, they were detached when Captain Ryan was given a mobile unit, which was to go to the South Pacific. I didn't go. Didn't have orders to that unit. I stayed at Pearl Harbor Hospital, and I was managed to get a house in Pearl City, which is around the bend from Pearl Harbor Hospital, Pearl Harbor. And that's where we were on Sunday morning, on December 7th. My wife and my 2 kids, and my pregnant wife and my 2 kids, and the Jap planes, as they came over, came right over Pearl City after they'd hit Battleship Row. So we were out looking at the planes, and right next door to me was a aviation machinist mate, first class. And he was running out there in his pajamas, and he looked up, he said, "Doc, I don't think those are our planes." And I said, "Well, what do you think?" He said, "Maybe they're Jap planes." He says, "I don't know." Well, anyway, about that time the phone rang and said, "You will report for duty." So I reported for duty, I was the junior officer of the day at the Pearl Harbor Hospital. That was my assigned job. Well, we made the tour to the hospital, around the base. There was, of course, smoke and fires a lot of places, including particularly on Battleship Row, but also there were a couple of areas where they had ships in, where they were repairing the ships. And my wife dropped me off at the hospital and was accosted by the military. Wanted to know what the hell she was doing there. And she decided the best place to go, and she was more or less directed up towards Aia Heights, where they had some Navy housing, and several of our acquaintances were housed up there, so Margaret and her two kids went up there. In the meantime, I picked my way through a number of service people, Navy sailors, who were on stretchers, and which stretched all the way up the stairs to our surgical ward on the second floor. And most of them were burned, had oil all over them, burned. And at any rate, I was still in my pajamas, so to speak, and we spent about 76 hours in the surgical service trying to take care of these people. We had problems which some doctors don't believe, but we had really very little to care for the burns on these people. They were using tea, dousing towels and putting it on tea on these people. We really had very little in the way of burn equipment. And among the others, we had one Jap flyer who had been shot down. He had some shrapnel in his neck, and he had nothing to say, but he stood at attention. I guess he figured we were going to decapitate him or something, but anyway, we anesthetized him, took the shrapnel out. That was the last I saw of him. But we had lots of other surgical performances to do, and for 76 hours we were pretty busy. In the meantime, while we were operating, they had a big sheet glass window in the hospital, and right across from us, across the channel, they had beached the Nevada, USS Nevada, ran to the shore to keep it from being sunk yet. And the Japs bombed that, and we had a few concussions and a little flying shrapnel from that, but otherwise nothing too exciting. And then, as I recall, we slept right in any convenient bed there was, and went back to surgery the next day. Well, really night and day were sort of mixed up, and I'm not too clear about some of the problems that we had in that respect, except the burns were really a major problem. We didn't have as much to do with as some of the medical people on the other wards. And of course, one of the unpleasanter tasks that eventuated was taking some of the people on the, or people who'd been killed or drowned or died of suffocation or whatever. They had a great number of corpses which they had down in the pathology, and it was up to the dentists, poor dentists, to identify a lot of these people by their dental charts, which was kind of a nasty problem. I was glad I wasn't a dentist at that point. But anyway, we eventually cleared a lot of people out of the wards. They were sent back by plane and also by ship to San Francisco. And our more usual activities of taking out appendices and operating on hernias and things of that sort continued until the Battle of Midway. And Battle of Midway was in June, and as you know, there was only one survivor of the torpedo TBF attack on the Japanese carriers. This fellow, I didn't think I'd forget his name, but anyway, he was a JG, and he saw most of the action after his plane was shot down under the seat of his plane, and he was floating around hoping that sharks didn't get him. But we had him on the ward. Actually, he was, you might say, a little bit in shock, but other than that, he was not a surgical case, really. He was in the officers' quarters. But we also then had the junior, or the executive officer off the Yorktown, which was sunk, and his name was Dixie Kiefer, quite a character. And he had a trick elbow that he was trying to call to the attention of the doctors. But actually, other than that, he was mostly concerned about losing the Yorktown because he felt that we should never have let the Japanese submarine that torpedoed the Yorktown get close enough to do the job. They had several destroyers out there. Actually, one of the destroyers was sunk by a Japanese torpedo, and as the ship sank, the destroyer sank, of course the crew had all jumped off the ship, but at about 25 or 50 feet or whatever, the depth charges on the back of the destroyer exploded and blew these guys out of the water. And it gave them a rather peculiar type of injury in that they had compression through the anus, and they had ruptured intestines and colons and so on. And so we spent 3 or 4 days trying to repair some of these people. There were 20 or 30 of them, as I recall. And one of the interesting things, and I shouldn't say this probably, maybe they'll delete this, but one of the operating doctors was a commander who was later the Surgeon General of the United States Navy. And he was his name was Pugh. And you can delete this if you don't like it. But he was using these old Murphy buttons, which were pretty much out of style. And the other doctors that we had there were finely trained university doctors, and we had surgeons from the Mayo Clinic, we had a couple of University of California professors of surgery and so on. And they did resections and so on, which was up to the minute technique. But Pew was practicing a technique that had gone out of style probably 20 years ago.
What's a Murphy button?
Well, there are two metal arrangements that you can snap together, but you can also tie an end of a intestine around each one. So you cut out a piece of the intestine, and then you sew in these Murphy buttons and snap them together, which sounded like a pretty good idea 50 years ago or 70 years ago now or something like that. But they weren't universally accepted because of various complications which they introduced. So anyway, that was one experience that I'm not not easily forgotten.
Well, no, we don't delete anything.
Okay, well, Pew's dead now, so I guess it doesn't make any difference. But he was one of the not the best surgeon. He had a habit of, I did quite a few operations with him as his assistant. He would pride himself on making about an inch incision when he took out an appendix. And I've never seen the large intestine open during an appendectomy, except with Pew. This happened to him 2 or 3 times that I know of. And we didn't think very much of his surgery. But he was a knowledgeable medical officer, and he had his finger on his number. And he was later transferred to the Naval Hospital in San Diego, and then he became Surgeon General of the Navy following the war, I guess. Anyway, my next experience was then I was transferred to the IE Heights Hospital, which had just been put in commission, and I served on the surgical and the orthopedic service up there for a period of time. And then, well, during that time, I was officer of the day on one occasion. I had my feet up on the desk when a group of men approached. So, not knowing, what was going on, I got to my feet, and this fellow walks in and said, "I'm Nimitz, and I want to see the commanding officer." He was just in, ordinary plain clothes. He didn't have any rigmarole on or anything. So I was glad I was on my feet. And that was the only time I had anything to do with that much brass. But anyway, later then I was transferred to the submarine service, and I was headed for Midway Island. My thought was that I knew nothing about submarines, and if I was going to be a submarine doctor, I at least ought to see the inside of a submarine. So I asked to be sent on a submarine to Midway, and they said, "Okay, but you have to go through this mumps and lung training and so on," which I did. And you go down to the different levels, down to 50 feet and 75 feet. They have a big tower there in Pearl, and they were putting their trainees through this, including me. So then I went to Midway on the Sawhorse, I guess it was. And it was a new submarine, had a relatively experienced crew, transferred from others. And they were very, very pleasant. I slept in the captain's quarters, and we spent 8 days getting to Midway. And during this, as we started out, we submerged to 300 or 400 feet, and then they did training with depth charges so that the crew and so on would become accustomed to the experience of depth charges at various distances, which was kind of an interesting experience. But anyway, after I got to Midway, which was in January, I guess it was.
Can I interrupt for a question?
Yes.
Did they just assign you to a submarine, or did you request something?
No, I requested that as long as I was going to go to the sub base as a submarine officer, medical officer for the submarine base, I asked to be transported on a submarine.
Right.
You know, otherwise they'd have probably flown me out there.
Right.
But they were very agreeable. As a matter of fact, after I got to Midway, one of the executive officers for the sub base suggested maybe I'd like to take a patrol in one of the submarines, but the skipper, Mickey O'Regan, said no, we needed a medical officer there. And you know what, they had 85 men on a submarine, and at that time we didn't have a whole lot more medical officers than needed, ships and so on. So I was spared that experience, which I don't particularly regret. I really didn't feel like spending 90 or 100 days in enemy seas. But we did have, shortly after I got there, one of the submariners developed an acute appendicitis, which was one of the bugaboos that used to worry the. And he was about halfway between Midway and Wake. And of course, the Japs had Wake, and we had Midway. So we got together a crew, and one of the senior medical officer for Midway was on this little ship. It really was just a cross between a boat and a ship, I suppose you'd say. A 90-foot deluxe cruiser or something that the Navy had taken over. And anyway, we spent about 9 days out looking for this submarine. In the meantime, they'd flown a PBY out and picked the guy up and taken him back to Midway and operated on him. So all we got was just an excursion out to Midway, the ocean. And anyway, then following this, my time at sea, originally, of course, I'd been designated as not eligible for sea duty, and about all I had was sea duty. So anyway, I then was transferred. Well, I put in for neurosurgery training, and instead of that, I got neuropsychiatric training at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, and that's where I was in the latter part of 1943 and part of 44. And thereafter, I was I was at Bethesda, and then I was at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which was an interesting experience, but it more or less strictly from an education standpoint. And then I was transferred at my request to the West Coast, to the San Diego training station, which was psychiatric unit, and this was, good duty, and really no particular complaints. And I was there during the last part of the war until about June or May, I guess, of 45, about the time that Roosevelt died. And then I was transferred, or had orders to go to the USS Hope, which was a hospital ship. Well, I made it as far as Pearl Harbor, where we were waiting transportation when the bomb was dropped and the Japs surrendered. So I never did get to the Hope, but I started the war at Pearl Harbor, and I ended the war at Pearl Harbor. And at any rate, I was transferred back on the Hornet, which had been out in the West Pacific, and it encountered one of the hurricanes that they had out there, and the flight deck, which was steel, was just bent back over the. It was useless as an aircraft carrier. So they were returning it for repairs. I came back on the Hornet, and then I was discharged in San Francisco. And while I was in line, this fellow that I hadn't seen since 1935, 36, slapped me on the back and said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Well, a few places." He said, "Well, I just got back from the South Pacific." And this was this Sam Zuckerman, who was a pathologist. He was at this time a commander. But it's a small world in some respects.
Right.
Well, after that, nothing. I kept my commission, and I was retired eventually as a captain. And I'm glad I stayed in the Navy.
You say you were discharged and kept your reserve commission.
Well, I was discharged from active duty, let's put it that way.
Okay. And what did you do on up to your
Well,
retirement?
then I went into general practice in Vallejo, and I practiced there for about a year. But I thought I'd follow up with my neuropsychiatric training, so I went up to the Mendocino State Hospital, which was something of an experience too, because we had about 5,000 patients, a lot of them from San Francisco and Oakland. Of course, the usual run of psychotics, so on. But we also had 1,200 criminally insane in a unit, which was something of an experience, because these people were paranoid and dangerous, and we lived on the compound, my wife and my 3 children, and actually we had help. They'd bring patients down from the hospital who seemed to be in good enough condition to work in the houses as gardeners and cooks and so on. And we had one of the other doctors up there, a fellow named Biddick, had a sergeant in the Marines who had murdered his sister-in-law, I believe, first. But he'd been up there since the war, and this was in 1947. And he seemed to be in pretty good shape, so they let him work in Biddick's house and run his gardener and so on. And Biddick was all in favor of, he was one of the psychiatrists, he was in favor of giving him parole. Well, this fellow went on parole, but he killed his father-in-law at that time, so they had to send him back to it. And one of the patients that we had helping us in the kitchen was a woman who'd killed her mother instead of her sister. And she was a paranoid schizophrenic. But she was a very nice woman. She'd been a teacher. But she began to get a little paranoid, so we had to send her back to the ward. So dealing with these patients was quite an educational experience. Well, following this, I decided that the Mendocino Hospital had 1 year residency credit with the National Board, so I decided I was going to get further training. So I transferred to the VA hospital at Sawtelle in Los Angeles, and I was on the neuropsychiatric ward there when I completed my training for my eligibility for the national board. I mean, for the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. Thereafter, I stayed with the veterans for about 3 or 4 years, and then transferred in. Well, I associated myself with 3 neurosurgeons, and we practiced in Inglewood, and Torrance, and after about 14 or 15 years, I decided I would move out of Inglewood, where we were, because of the changing environment, and I moved down on Palos Verdes, which was a very nice place, and I practiced in Torrance by myself until I was 75. About I ended my my active career.
How did you come to East Tennessee to live?
Say again?
How did you come to Knoxville to live? How did that happen?
Well, our oldest daughter, Mary, who lives here, Mrs. Ayers, was about 17, I believe, at the time we were living in Santa Monica, and I was at the VA.
Mm-hmm.
And she was going to St. Mary's College, and we were hoping she'd get a complete education. And then, but she decided she was enamored of a young sailor who'd gotten out of the service, and they were planning to get married, and Murray was going to put him through school. Well, this didn't sound like a very good idea to me, and it so happened that we had my sister-in-law and her husband, who he had a plumbing shop here, Gray and Hodges, and they had asked, well, we'd visited them on occasions, so they said, well, why don't you send Murray back here? Got a university back here. And so Murray reluctantly agreed to go back for 1 semester. She said, I'll be back. Well, she never came back. So she finished up, one of the few gals in her group, I guess. She got her degree, got married the next day, and she and Tommy Ayers, well, he spent some time in the Air Force.
Yeah, I've known Tommy
Yeah.
a long time.
Well, and then they came back here, and from time to time, Murray would come to see us in California, but then finally, we were visiting here about 2.5 years ago. During that time, they had the storm, and just prior to the storm, my wife was over at Joe Ayers, which was one of Murray's sons, and she stepped backwards and fell off the short step, but she broke her hip. And she's had problems with that ever since. And she was in the hospital during the snowstorm. They put some pins in her hip, and then we took her back to Mission VAO, where we were living in California. But she was having back problem and pain in her left. And so after several trips, Murray said, you know, it'd be easier for us if you just moved back to Knoxville. And of course, my wife, Margaret, also has a sister who was Philip Gray's wife. Elsie Gray lives here. So we moved here 2 years ago, and I was kind of reluctant to leave Mission VAO because I'd lived in California a large part of my life. My father died in 1917 from the effects of yellow fever.
I see.
and now I turn it off.
It's okay. It's about to run out. Anyway.
Well, I was going to say, you ought to listen to Russ.
Okay.
He's had a much
Okay.
more interesting experience than I have.